I would like to introduce Professor Nurit Gronau from currently at the Open University, but I want to tell you a little bit about her. She did her psychology degrees, including her PhD in the Hebrew University, and then she continued to do a postdoc in Harvard Medical School, actually in Moshe Bar's lab. And now she is a faculty in the Open University at the psychology department at the Open University, and she is also the head of the department at this time. And she does a lot of things about attention and vision, and we are very delighted to have you here, and we'd be happy to hear what you want to tell us today. Welcome.
Thank you. Toda, Sharon. Okay, I don't see myself. I don't know if you see me. I see you, Sharon?
No, we see you.
Oh, okay. Okay.
We see you on the screen.
Okay, fine. So I called my lecture Vision at a Glance, the role of attention in object and scene categorization. And this is one of the projects that I've been engaged in the last few years, as you'll see. Let me just get to the PowerPoint. Okay. So my study taps a long-lasting question in the literature concerning the role of attention in visual processing and recognition. Sharon, maybe we can just mute everybody. If there's some noises. Sharon? Okay. Okay. Can you hear me now? I'm hoping you can.
Yes, we can.
Okay, okay, thank you. Okay, so specifically, there has been ample research devoted to the question to what extent are unattended stimuli processed and consciously recognized. And you've noticed that I've used the terms unattended versus attended. Obviously, this is not a dichotomy between these two regions in attention, rather more of a gradient of attention. But so I apologize for using these terms, but what I really mean is areas in vision or in the visual field that are more attended versus less attended. And this topic has attracted much interest along the history because it can shed light or tell us a lot about the factors that capture or guide our attention in the field, the extent to which we are responsive to stimuli outside our attentional focus, and on the other hand, of course, the limits and the constraints of our cognitive system, on which I will talk in the current talk. So before we start talking about attention, one probably needs to define what is attention, and there have been several definitions to this process or mechanism along the history. I will use a very basic definition that sees attention as a selection mechanism that assists in focusing on specific information, and on the other hand, ignoring or perhaps even inhibit other irrelevant information. And some have used the metaphor of a spotlight, which is sort of a classic metaphor where things that are attended or objects that are attended are under the light. They reach a very high level of processing, probably they affect our behavior and our consciousness, whereas things that are sort of unattended or less attended are somewhere in the darkness. They obviously receive less processing resources. And the question again is, okay, how high of the processing, high level of processing do they actually obtain or receive? Historically, this is a very old dispute. Actually, it goes back to the pioneering studies in cognitive psychology between theories of early selection versus late selection theories of theory. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with this, but I will say just a few words about this because it's totally related to what I'm going to talk about. The big debate is, as I've started mentioning, where does the attentional mechanism sort of kick into the processing stages within cognition? Does it kick in a very early stage of processing, meaning that the filter of attention is at a very low level. So anything that passes this filter is processed and reaches consciousness and awareness and our behavior, whereas anything that is below that filter does not pass on to, let's say, consciousness and behavior. This would be the early selection theory versus a late selection theory, which places the filter at a very late stage, meaning that actually even objects, scenes, processes that occur before attention, the attention mechanism kicks into the process, they would be processed to a rather high level. Okay, so the early selection would say that only attended stimuli are processed to a high level, whereas the late selection theories argued that both attended and unattended or pre-attended stimuli are processed to a rather high level. And attention mainly affects higher, even higher processes or later processes such as response selection processes or decision-making processes, stages, etc. And just to mention historically, this debate was very hot in the 60s, 70s, 80s. It's somewhat subsided during the 90s, partially due to the perceptual load theory proposed by Neely Levy, that argued that in fact there's no dichotomy here between early or late selection, and it's actually a matter of context. So what Levy argued is that the level of processing, for instance, in a specific task, is a function of the level of difficulty of the task. So if we take a metaphor of a glass, if the glass is full, which is sort of a situation in which I'm currently engaged in a very hard, difficult task, okay? So it engages most of my cognitive resources. There are no extra resources to process things that are sort of outside my main focus of attention. Whereas if my focus of attention is engaged by a rather simple task or an easy task, I still have spare resources that, according to Neely Levy, sort of spill out to other regions which are outside the main focus of attention, and therefore they will be processed to a rather high level. So the bottom line is that early selection or late selection are a function of the difficulty of the task or the amount of resources that I need to devote to a task to which I am focused on. So it's not really a matter of this or this, it's a matter of context. I do need to say that in recent years, there has been accumulating criticism against the theory, which I'll totally not go into, but it's important to know that there have been a lot of criticisms against the theory, and today it's less popular than it was in the 90s. Importantly, most of the early research has used, the pioneering research has used meaningless, arbitrary, or symbolic stimuli such as letters, at least in the visual domain, I should say. Less so in the auditory domain. But in the visual domain, typical experiments would use letters as you see here. For instance, the task could be find the odd letter or find the L among the T's, which is actually a pretty difficult task when you have many letters in the visual scene. You need to search each one of them until you find the L. Or find the conjunction between a color and specific orientation. For instance, here it's the central X here that you can see here. Or find a certain letter which is predefined as a target. For instance, find the B, okay, the B letter. And at the same time, there would be some kind of a distractor that appears, in this case, let's say the S, that appears outside the relevant locations for the target. So it appears in an irrelevant location. You know you're not supposed to search there, but still it would distract you. And the question is, why does it distract you? To what amount does it distract you? What are the properties of this distraction, of this letter that could potentially distract you, etc. In the last 2 decades, however, a new wave of studies has brought the subject, this whole dispute, back to front stage. And these studies have used realistic photographs of real-world objects and scenes. And the main argument was that these stimuli benefit, since they're real-world stimuli. We're not born to see letters, orientations, and colors and search for them. but we aren't born into scenes. We're born into learning objects. We're exposed every day, actually all our lives, to visual input, which is real world objects from the world. And such stimuli therefore benefit from extensive training and very high familiarity levels. And therefore, these stimuli might actually behave differently than arbitrary stimuli, such as letters that we learn at a relatively late age, or just arbitrary, meaningless stimuli. And the main idea is that since we're so extensively trained on these stimuli, we might actually be able to recognize them and process them, even when they appear in an unattended location of the visual field. So for instance, if we take the scene, the argument would be that if I'm focusing on this woman here, the question is what happens, and suppose she's doing something and I'm now thinking about what she's doing, is she's helping her son or her husband or something, it's not really clear. What happens outside the focus of my attention? Okay, if I'm focused right now, is it really some kind of a very blurred picture which allows only very, very basic features to be processed, such as maybe colors and maybe very coarse shapes or orientations? Or do we actually know what's going on there? So we actually know that there's an umbrella and a chair and whatever. And this whole scene is a beach, even though it's outside my main focus of attention, which is on this, my main visual focus of attention, which is on this woman. So this is really the question. What happens in this sort of dark or darker area of the visual field? And one of these studies that has sort of triggered this renewed dispute is a study by Lee, Van Rooyen, Koch, and Perona from 2002 that, as you can see here in the title, actually argued that there is natural scene categorization or sort of identification of the scene's category, or it's just in the near absence of attention, or actually with very minimal attention. I will show you their paradigm just to explain what it's all about. So they used a dual task in which actually participant had to perform two tasks simultaneously. They had a very demanding central task, while at the same time they had to detect a certain category, predefined category, in the periphery of their vision. So this is an example of the central task. At the fovea, at the center of the screen, participant had to detect the odd letter, in this case, the L among T's, or it could be a T among L's. As I mentioned before, this is a typical sort of what we call conjunction search task. It's a difficult task. It takes time to find the L. And obviously, the example I'm showing you here is pretty simple, but if you have many of these T's on the screen, it's much more difficult. And at the same time, or a few milliseconds after that, an object appeared at the periphery, someplace at the periphery of their vision. And the question was, is there an animal in this scene or in this image or picture that appears in the periphery? And participants had to first actually detect the animal and say, was there an animal, yes or no? And was there an odd, where is the odd letter on the screen in the central task? And note that the animal appeared, or the object was not necessarily an animal, only if there was a target, it was an animal. The image appeared for a very, very short duration, for 27 milliseconds, and disappeared. Participants responded, and the animals were taken from a very wide variety of subcategories. So there were mammals, birds, fish. In other words, it was a very large superordinate category, which can tell us that people were not tuned to a specific animal or tuned to find a specific, very specific feature that characterizes a specific animal, but rather they were expecting to see any type of animal that could appear, and yet they were very good in this task. So the findings, just before the findings, they compared this dual task with a single task condition in which there was only a peripheral task. So participants focused on the scene, they had no task whatsoever at the center of the scene, but they still had to identify the peripheral animal, or to detect whether there was an animal or not in the periphery. And the results showed that the accuracy performance for the peripheral task was actually identical with the single and the dual task conditions, which is quite surprising because the central task is, as I said, a pretty difficult one. And they compared this dual task performance with a control experiment in which they actually showed these arbitrary stimuli, similar to the ones I've shown you before, that have been used for many years in early work, such as these. So in this case, the dual task was find the L among the T's in the center of the screen, and in addition, detect whether the periphery contained a T or an L, or whether it contained a disk with a, as you can see here, with a green part on the left and a red on the right, or the opposite way. This is very, very difficult task. And in fact, people perform pretty bad on this dual task. So when people had to perform this type of dual task, their performance was very low relative to this single task. Whereas, as I mentioned before, when they had to detect the animal, they were actually very good at that. So this led the authors to conclude that rapid visual categorization, it was very rapid actually, what later was called even ultra rapid visual categorization of natural scenes or objects, requires very little or perhaps even no focal attention, because people are capable of doing it even while they're performing a very demanding task at the center or at the main focus of their attention. There were several other follow-up studies on this study by the same group or by other groups that have shown that we're actually capable of even discriminating gender, much more, fine-tuned gender discriminations, and even to identify a specific face. All of these are done with little or even no focal attention. We're able to recognize a specific context outside our focus of attention, and so on. And more recently, there has been a line of several studies showing that, or arguing that, actually meaning, we are able to process the meaning of object outside the focus of attention, and these actually guide our attention. So this really makes sense, because this is, or I should say it differently, this is what is so important about this question, because it can tell us not only what do we process sort of in this dark area, but what would guide our attention. Because if we process something really important, we would probably want to shift our attention to this region. If we don't process it, we'll just ignore it for the good or for the bad. And a similar dispute concerning this high-level processing also has arisen concerning the relational processing among objects. Okay, so can we or can we not process semantic relations among objects that are presented outside our main focus of attention? And here again, several studies have argued that yes, not only visual saliency, but also semantic relations, in this case, semantic incongruency. So semantic incongruency refers to all these studies who show you, for instance, a rooster in your office, but the rooster is not presented within your focus of attention. It's presented, let's say, somewhere in the periphery. And let's say one of the arguments, as the one you can see here, is that it attracts your eye movement, it attracts your attention. Meaning that if it attracted my attention, it was probably recognized without my attention, or with very little attention, because it was outside the focus of my visual attention, or of my central vision. And other papers also arguing very similar arguments. And even further, studies have showed that relational processing can not only occur with minimal attention, but also when we're totally unconscious. Okay, and there have been several studies along these lines, arguing that we are actually quite capable of doing a lot of things without attention and without awareness. So these studies can imply that individual objects are processed without attention, or perhaps with minimal attention or awareness. And even their associative relations with their attended surroundings can be additionally processed. So these studies can all imply that we're actually pretty omnibus in our capabilities of processing things that are going on sort of in the dark area, the dark side of the moon. However, of course, there was also opposing evidence of studies that actually argued that processes of identification, categorization, detection of objects do actually require attention, and they're not attention-free. Sorry, these are the citations. So despite this long history, as I mentioned, this is a dispute that has actually started in the pioneering studies of psychology since the late 50s. This is still a disputable topic, and this also reminds me a really nice and important paper that came out in 2004 regarding word and letter identification. They did not use real-world images. That was termed 45 years after broadband, where broadband is the representative of the early selection theory. There's still no identification without attention. This was a very long review paper showing you that yes, the dispute is still here, and now it's sort of shifted somewhat to images, objects in the visual field. So why is this important? It's important because it allows us to comprehend the power or the breadth of our cognitive capacity on the one hand, and on the other hand, obviously, the limits of our cognitive system in everyday vision. And of course, it also has implications for higher level processing, such as consciousness, working memory, long-term memory, and other processes that I will not go into today. But note that in most previous studies, participants actively categorized objects and scenes as part of their task requirements. So for instance, if we take the dual task, which was and is a pretty popular paradigm, in the dual task, one needs to process simultaneously two types or to be engaged in two types of tasks. And this may actually overestimate what is happening in the so-called unattended region. I will go into this in depth in just a few slides, so I'm letting myself go on to this overestimation of these unattended processing. On the other hand, there are other paradigms in which scene categorization is not an explicit part of the task, like in the dual paradigm. Yet participants were asked to explicitly report or to respond to the nature of the object seen. For instance, to actually identify what have they seen and to report it. So for instance, if you take the inattentional blindness paradigm, which was used a lot, for those of you who are familiar with this paradigm, people are focused on a specific stimulus for several trials, and then suddenly appears another new novel stimulus, and they're asked to report its identity. And the basic result, the basic finding is that a lot of people miss this novel or unattended object or stimulus, suggesting that they were not able to actually process it. But some studies actually argue that our abilities are much higher, but then again, we are requested in this type of paradigm to explicitly report the identity of the object. So this may rely on working memory resources, and it's dependent on response criteria and other issues that may actually underestimate our ability to process these objects at the time of their appearance, because the report is always performed after the stimulus already disappears from the screen. So in our research, we sought to investigate the question of the necessity of visual attention to object and scene categorization using a slightly different approach, in which stimuli processing was assessed implicitly rather than explicitly asking participants to detect the animal or to report what was the identity of the stimulus. And importantly, stimuli were not prioritized by task demand, such as in the dual task, and the assessment of the stimulus processing was less prone to working memory capacity limitations, as for instance in the inattentional blindness. And I'll explain shortly, so I think things will be clearer. So in the current study, we asked whether objects and scenes are categorized under what we call unattended or less attended, minimally attended conditions, where stimuli are presented outside the main focus of spatial attention. They are not part of the task set. This was very important. Okay, so in a sense, they are sort of task irrelevant, or they're non-prioritized by task settings. And we measured stimulus processing indirectly rather than via explicit report. And actually, we manipulated two main parameters. One is the location of the stimulus, whether it's presented sort of what we call within the main focus of attention or outside the main focus of attention, and the type or the identity of the stimulus. Is it relevant to our current goals, as in, for instance, the dual task paradigm, where I'm actively searching for an animal? Or is it irrelevant? I'm searching for an animal, but there's something else appearing out there. So how do we measure this categorical processing implicitly in a behavioral manner? Our basic paradigm was that in each trial, we had pairs of objects appearing on the screen, as you can see here. And if you notice, we had two categories in this case appearing on the screen. One is the animals and the others of transportation. However, participants search for a third, totally unrelated target category. So in this case, in this specific experiment, I'll get to this in the next slide. I'll just say before that we utilized what we called a categorical effect obtained among these non-targets. So all of these examples that you see on the screen are what I termed non-targets, because I'm searching for a third category, which is the target category, okay? And we're searching for a categorical effect among these non-targets when both objects are attended. And I'm going to compare this categorical effect to a situation in which one of the two objects is attended and the other is less attended or minimally attended. Okay, I'll show you the experiment, and I think things will be clearer. You'll understand what I'm meaning and what is my goal. So this is how a trial looked. The object appeared briefly, very brief, for 23 milliseconds. They were masked, and we actually followed pretty similar times of the original Lee and Van Roolen studies. You might think, wow, this is so short. Do they actually even see anything? And the answer is definitely yes. You are able to see and recognize pretty even simply under such short durations, brief durations. And of course, it also matters how strong is your mask. But in our conditions, people could definitely see and recognize these objects. And I just remind you, the task is there nonsense objects in the display? So, and these are the types of nonsense objects that we had. They were simple photoshopped, meaningless shapes. So this is an example of a trial of a no, answer no. And this is an example of a yes, that you see this little thing here. It's not a croissant, it's actually a non-object, a nonsense object. Okay, we used a wide variety of objects within each real-world object category, very similar to the categories used by Lee and Van Roolen. And this was meant to prevent participants from tuning themselves, as I said before, to very specific, highly specific features, okay? If you're searching for a horse, you know exactly how a horse looks like. You can tune yourself to very specific features. When you're searching for animals in general, it's a little harder. So we had animals and transportation, as you can see here. And the critical condition is that within these trials that contained only real-world objects or only non-targets, the stimuli either belonged to same or to different categories. So here an example for a same trial. Either we had two animals or two vehicles, and this is a different trial. So we had an animal and a vehicle, or again, animal and a vehicle, and of course the location was totally random between the upper and the lower screen position. Just reminding you, participants are searching for a nonsense target stimulus, and this nonsense stimulus could potentially appear either in upper or a lower location. So participants had to scan actually both object locations in order to find their target. So they're distributing attention across the whole screen, or the whole area that's relevant for the experiment. And these are the experiments, and this is actually our basic results, which serves as a baseline to further follow-up experiments. What we get is that participants are faster to say, again, they're searching for the nonsense object. There is no nonsense object because there are two real-world objects in the display. So they're faster to say no, to respond no. This was a key press when the two objects are from the same category, for instance, two animals, then from different categories. For instance, an animal and a vehicle. And there could be several reasons for this faster response when there are two objects from the same category, because they're more similar, they share features, they perhaps prime themselves each other because they share the same semantic world. We can think of several reasons why this is the case, but this is a very consistent response. Participants are faster when there are two objects from the same category than different categories. But this is only, as I said, the baseline condition. So despite its irrelevance to task requirements in the sense that participants are searching for a different category, categorical identity affected performance in the stimulus classification task where both objects were attended. And then we asked, would a categorical effect, a similar categorical effect, so the categorical effect is what I call when we see a difference between same and different conditions, same category versus different category conditions. Would this categorical effect be obtained when one of the two objects is presented sort of outside the main focus of attention or in a less attended location? And I remind you, it's strictly irrelevant to participants' tasks. It's not this animal that I'm actually searching for. So in the next experiment, we had one of the two objects presented in what we called an unattended location or minimally attended location. And for this, we had a spatial cue that draws visual attention to one of the two objects prior to stimuli appearance, indicating the target's location. And now we asked, is there a nonsense object in the cued location only, rather than in both stimulus locations? So this is how it looked. We had a cue that appeared right before the appearance of the images. Now we know that subjects are supposed to respond only to the attended location or the cued location, whereas the unattended object becomes actually an irrelevant distractor that they can totally ignore. It's located outside the main focus of visual attention, it's uncued, it's an irrelevant distractor, they can simply ignore it. And again, a reminder, it's not part of our task, but in this case, it's an animal, so it's not prioritized by task demands. Now we ask, will we still get this categorical effect that we've seen before? And the answer is no, the categorical effect disappears. And if we look at the difference between this and the results that we've seen before, when both objects appeared or were part of the task set and they were both attended, then we see this nice interaction. So the categorical effect was eliminated when an irrelevant object distractor was positioned outside the main focus of attention, suggesting that the distractor may actually not be automatically categorized, or at least it does not affect our responses. Do we have any indication for any processing outside the focus of attention? Okay, we've seen that this categorical effect that is based on categorizing real-world objects is eliminated, but we don't really assume that it's a total darkness out there. We do know that there must be some processing in the uncued location. Or is there, in other words, is there at least some indication for low-level feature processing that we know that should occur there? Can people, for instance, dissociate these real from nonsense objects, which is based on very coarse visual processing? Because if you look at these objects, they're very, very different visually. They are, the artificial objects were very colorful, very different from the real world objects. Can people make these distinctions, even when one of the two objects appears in an unattended location? So here we had an additional informative condition, which is the condition where we had a cued object, in this case a real world object, to which participants respond, no, there's no target here, because they're searching for the nonsense object. Whereas in the uncued location, in the sort of unattended or less attended location, there is either a real world or a nonsense object. So in this case, when there's a real world object, the the object distractor, which appears in the distractor location, corresponds with the same response to the cued object. So this is sort of what we would call a response congruent trial. Whereas here we have a response incongruent because the nonsense object activates a yes response, even though it's presented in the periphery. So in fact, and we also have the opposite, of course, case in which we have a nonsense object that is cued and a either nonsense or real world object in the periphery, in the uncued location. So this is very similar to actually a flanker paradigm, which can indicate whether participants were actually sensitive or not to the appearance of real versus nonsense objects outside the main focus of attention. And the answer is yes. When we look at this sort of flanker effect or the response congruency effect, we get a very strong effect. So despite the lack of a categorical effect that we've seen before, participants were able to dissociate real objects from nonsense distractors, similarly as evident from this response congruency effect. We had an additional set of experiments in which we examined what we called contextual binding or contextual associative processes. Again, what I call inside and outside the main focus of attention, or when both objects are attended versus a situation in which only one is attended and the other is unattended or minimally attended. And the paradigm was, as you can see here, we had two objects appearing, which were either contextually related, such as a lamp and a small desk, versus two objects which were unrelated to each other semantically. Sorry, we know that typically people are faster to respond to a coherent scene than to an incoherent scene. So people will be faster on the left than on the right trial. And here we examine the effects of spatial relations among these contextually associated pairs. So this is a normal scene, whereas here the spatial relations are jumbled or they're inconsistent, they're unexpected, and therefore we expect the left case to be responded faster to than the right case. So in our first experiment, we have the same paradigm. Participants were asked to look for a nonsense object in the display. And once again, in these non-target trials, where there is no search target, okay, only real world objects, participants are indeed faster to say, no, there's no nonsense object when there is a coherent scene relative to an incoherent scene. And now we ask what happens when one of the two objects is cued and the other is incued and becomes actually an irrelevant distractor. Once again, we had a cue that you can see here. So in this case, the kettle is the cued region in the display. Okay, this is the object that you need to respond to. Is it a nonsense object or not? No, it's not a nonsense object. And we're asking what would be the effect of this cup here that is either spatially consistent or inconsistent with the cued object. And once again, you see that the effect is actually eliminated. The spatial inconsistency effect is eliminated. When we look at it near our previous results, we see this nice interaction. We could still look, or as we did before, at this response congruency effect, look at the effect of distractors that are either real world objects or nonsense objects. And once again, we get a very strong response congruency effect, or this sort of flanker-like effect. Again, suggesting that participants can dissociate real from nonsense distractor objects, which can imply that there is coarse visual processing, even in this sort of dark region outside the main focus of attention. But this, of course, raises several questions. One of the questions is, does this response congruency effect truly stem from these low-level visual differences between the real object and the nonsense stimuli? Okay, that indicates, as I said, some coarse processing outside the main focus of attention, or simply from the fact that people are sensitive to the search target, which even if it appears outside the focus of attention. So again, I have a non-searched or a non-target object appearing in the cued location to which I need to respond. And in the periphery, in the uncued location, appears something that I'm actively searching for, which is very similar to that paradigm that I showed you before of searching for an animal. In that case, it was an animal. In this case, it's a nonsense object. Maybe it's just the fact that I'm actually searching for it, which activates it more than other objects or other categories, and therefore it would influence my behavior, even if it appears in a underprivileged location in the visual field. And let's go back to a classical study in 1992 in the visual attention literature. Anyone in attention knows this very classical study of Folk, Remington, and Johnston, actually showing that when I'm searching for a specific object that contains a certain feature, this feature can involuntarily capture my attention, even if it appears in the wrong location, in the wrong timing, etc. Even if it's a total distractor, I know I should ignore it. If it contains a specific feature that I'm searching for, it will involuntarily capture my attention. So during goal-oriented search, when I have a predefined target or a category, presumably I'm activating some feature-based attention mechanism, which causes increased activation or perhaps lower threshold for recognizing the specific features I'm actually searching for. And if we go back again to this experiment, so I'm the original experiment of Lee et al. In 2002, so I'm conducting this task at the center. There's an animal. I'm searching for specific features of animals, and presumably these features are highly activated, even if they do not appear in my main focus of spatial attention, even if they appear in a region which is spatially outside my focus of my vision and my attention. So to uncouple these two factors, again, I'm returning to the question before, is our response congruency effect due to these low-level differences between real and nonsense objects, or is it all about task relevance? I'm searching for the nonsense objects, therefore I'm processing it, even when it's in the on-cued location. We need to eliminate these low-level visual differences between the two distractor types. And indeed, in the next experiment, we used a real-world object category that replaced these nonsense target stimuli. So if we go back to our categorical effect, rather than having a nonsense object target category that people are searching for, now they're searching for a third real world object category, in this case, clothes. Of course, all three categories that we used, which were animal, transportation, and clothes, served as the targets. They were counterbalanced across subjects. And the main idea is that there's one target category and two non-target categories. And again, as you can see, when we look at the non-target categories and when both stimuli are attended, so now you're searching for you're searching for the target category among any of the two locations, okay, you're attending both locations, then we can see again this categorical effect that we've seen before. However, when we're using the queuing paradigm, we lose this categorical effect, just as we've seen before. We see this nice interaction, but now we're interested in what happens with the actual target category when it's presented in the uncued location, or when it's presented in the distractor location. These are the two non-target trials, as I've shown you before. We've seen that there's no difference under the queuing conditions. And now we're asking again, what happens when, in this case, an article of clothing, which is my target I'm searching for, appears in the periphery. And we'd like to compare these two conditions, because note that in both cases we have different categories, okay, a vehicle and an animal, a piece of clothes and an animal, okay? But we're asking what happens when my search target appears in the uncued location. One case is congruent, the other is incongruent. And indeed, we still get a very strong difference between the two, suggesting it's not necessarily about the visual differences, but it's more about the task, the relatedness to task goals. So despite the lack of the categorical effect, distractors did interfere with task performance when they were prioritized by task demands or when they were a search target in the task. And this implies that there is a dissociation between prioritized or searched and non-prioritized or non-searched distractors, as we've just seen. Some additional questions. Is it all about target prioritization? So we've talked about this feature-based attention that presumably tunes my attention to specific features. Therefore, I can and I would detect a search target even if it appears outside my main focus of attention, but is it all about this? And note that in the present paradigm that I've just shown you, when both objects were within the main focus of attention, participants performed the task on both items. Whereas in the cued condition, the task was performed only on the cued object. As we've said, the second object became actually sort of an irrelevant distractor. And perhaps the distractor actually was effectively categorized, but participants just chose to ignore this information due to the object's non-prioritized status. So they know that this is a distractor that they can ignore. Maybe they recognize that it's a tractor, or at least that it's a vehicle, some kind of vehicle, but they just choose to ignore it. And therefore, we do not obtain this categorical effect. So the question is, do we, or actually can we ignore any non-prioritized object at any situation, or regardless of its location? And in the next experiment, we had a non-prioritized object appearing in a prioritized location, and I'll explain. We had an irrelevant distractor that was placed in a location that we assumed that was visually attended, which is fixation. Let me show you. We had actually 3 locations in this experiment. So we had the fixation location and another location above and below. And the instructions were always respond to the peripheral object only. Okay, so if this is a trial, for example, the tractor appears at fixation, the duck appears or the goose appears at the periphery. Participants need to respond to the peripheral objects, which could either appear in an upper or a lower location, and actually to ignore the distractor. But we assume that the distractor, since it appears at fixation, and since we know that fixation is typically correlated with visual attention, we assume that it would be visually attended. So we assume that actually, despite participants' attempt to ignore this, they will not be very successful in this. And in this case, we might actually get a categorical effect, as we've seen in the situation when both objects are attended. So we hypothesize that despite its non-prioritized status as a distractor, the distractor would be actually successfully categorized due to its prioritized location and fixation. And this is actually what we've obtained. So we see that the object categorization is a function of both task and the visual or the spatial prioritization. Another important question. We've seen a strong effect among the prioritized targets. Okay, the non-targets, the nonsense targets in the first experiment, and the third category, which was defined as a target category in the follow-up experiments. Can it actually be explained by the response conflict that is evident in this congruency effect, rather than by mere sensitivity to the differences among the categories? So again, if we go back to their conditions, on the left we have the non-target conditions, okay? The same 2 animals or different category, an animal and a vehicle, which are defined as non-targets. On the right, we have a situation in which I'm responding to a non-target, an animal, but the search target, which in this case, in this example, is the category of clothes, appears in my periphery. Okay, and we're comparing these two conditions. The one is congruent in terms of the response activation, because both responses here activate the no, there is no target category in the display, whereas here it's incongruent because the cued object to which I'm responding activates the no, whereas the uncued object, the distractor, activates the yes, here's my target. So is it all about just response conflict? So in the next experiment, we wanted to balance this, the differences between targets and non-targets, and actually solve this question. And for this purpose, we used 2 targets rather than 1. So in fact, there were 4 categories altogether. So the task was now, not only is there, let's say, a closed category in the display or in the queued location, but is the target in the queued location an article of clothing or a piece of furniture, which was in this instance a fourth category. So this is how, let's say, two trials within the target categories could look. One in which the two objects were from the same category. They're both targets, they're both pieces of clothes. And one in which there was a queued article of clothing and another target, but a different category, in this case, furniture, okay? But they're, in all cases, they are all targets, and therefore in all cases, this is a congruent. In terms of the response conflict, there's no conflict here because all four items activate the response of, yes, here's a target. Just as the case with the non-targets. So now we can look at the categorical effect among the targets when they are both congruent in both cases. And now we can see that if you look at the left bars, this is the result for the non-target again. Okay, so these are the two categories I'm not searching for again, as we had before in the example, the animals and the vehicles. No difference between them. But among the target categories, okay, we eliminated the response congruency factor and we still get a very strong response. Okay, and this is obviously significant. We can still look at the distraction effect when there is a congruency effect, okay? So we still have the condition where there's a non-target in the queued location and there is a target that conflicts with the response to the non-target, just as we looked at before. And we still get an additional slowing of the response. So certainly there's a component of conflict, response conflict in this response, but this is not the whole story. There's definitely also the mere fact that I'm searching for this category, it's defined as a target, and this raises my sensitivity to this category, even when it appears in an unqueued location. So the response conflict indeed contributes to the categorical effect within the target items, but it does not tell the whole story. It does not fully account for it. Okay, Sharon, how much time do we have? Can I steal another 5 minutes? I can't hear you.
We have now additional 5 minutes, but if you want to take another 5, I mean, I would be happy if there would be time for questions, but sure.
Okay, so I'll go quick about for this part.
Okay.
To what degree can we generalize? I'll take another like 5 minutes and then we'll leave time for question.
Okay, lovely.
Okay. So to what degree can we generalize these findings? Can we generalize them to all types of stimuli? Or are there any unique stimuli that may be automatically recognized even when they're presented in an unattended location and they're strictly task irrelevant? And the two immediate suspects are obviously scenes and faces. I'll go really quickly. I'll skip the introduction because I think you all know about scene processing and how quickly we are sensitive to the gist of a scene. And we ran a very similar series of studies with these scenes. And basically we had 3 superordinate categories of scenes, which are nature, urban, and indoor, as you can see here. We had, again, a situation in which participants were attended to both scenes versus to only one. And the results are basically the same. Again, we see an effect, a categorical effect when they're both attended, but no categorical effect when one of the 2 scenes is unqueued or unattended. We also receive the same results when we have an object superimposed on a background scene, and there could be associative relations between the object and the scene. So we use 3 types of objects: objects that are associated with nature, which are animals; with urban scenes, which are vehicles; and with indoor scenes, which are all kinds of furniture and appliances or tools that are used indoor. And we looked at the associative relations between the object and the scene. Again, I'll just skip to the results. We get a strong associative relation when they are both attended, but when only one is attended, we see that there's, again, this dissociation as we've seen before. So scenes behave very much like other everyday object categories. What about faces? And this will be the end of the talk. So well, this is a really highly controversial subject. I don't have time to go into it, but we looked at a very similar paradigm to the one we used before with faces, where here we use three categories: animals, transportation, and faces, where the task was always, is there an animal or means of transportation, a vehicle in the queued location, as you can see here. But the critical thing is that the face was always a non-target. It was never the search target. Okay, so it could appear in the periphery, but it was never searched for, just as we had non-targets in other experiments. Okay, we tried to use a wide variety of faces, similar to the wide variety of images that we have in animals and in the vehicles categories. And these are the results when one of the two faces is unattended with the unqueued condition. And surprisingly, actually, for the first time, we've actually found a category that even when it appears in a periphery and even when you're not actively searching for it, there's a small but a statistically significant effect, a categorical effect as we've searched for before. Okay, so this was a little surprising. I was pretty pessimistic about this experiment. And this suggests that faces actually may be automatically detected and categorized even when they're unattended. But note that there's a possible confound here, which is the small categorical variance among faces. So until now, we used very large, wide categories that are superordinate categories, whereas faces are actually a basic level category. All faces share the same configuration. They're very similar to each other. They're not similar to a wide variety of animals or vehicles that we had. So in our next experiment, which probably will be the last one I'll show you, we ran a very similar experiment to the ones we used before, but only with narrowed basic level categories, which allow high predictability at the distracted location because they're very narrow. The categories we use, as you can see, they're all basic level categories, are cars, houses, and chairs. They're very highly distinctive for each other. And here, similar to the result with the faces, even when we use the queuing paradigm, okay, so one of the two objects is attended, the other is outside your main focus of attention, we still get this categorical effect. Okay, so narrow categories can be processed outside the focus of visual attention, even when they're strictly task relevant or they're non-prioritized by task requirements. And in this sense, faces may actually not be so special. Obviously, there's also the distinctiveness among these categories. I will just tell you that when you run the same experiment, but only with three basic level categories, but there's large overlap between them because these are all furniture, they share some features, then you lose the effect. Okay, so it's a lot about the distinctiveness of the categories. You still, though, get this congruency effect that I've showed you before. So when you're searching for a specific category, it still affects your response even though it's a distractor and even though the three categories are overlapping. Okay, so to sum up all of these experiments, we looked at the necessity of visual attention to categorical processing. When we used wide stimulus categories at the superordinate level, there was a dissociation between processing of categorical information presented, what I called inside versus outside the main focus of attention. Our findings suggest that unattended stimuli, which are strictly irrelevant or are not searched actively by the participant, may not be automatically categorized. However, the very same categorical information does affect our behavior when it is part of the task set, where I'm actively searching for it, and it's prioritized by the task. Overall, our findings support models that argue for the necessity of attention to object categorization and recognition. Nevertheless, participants fail to filter out very narrow categories or subcategories presented at an unattended location given sufficient categorical distinctiveness. So distinctiveness and predictability are very important factors in this processing, in this sort of this dark area. And we think that involuntary categorization is most likely based on local features or global shape properties or some kind of feature-based or object-based attention mechanism. And in this sense, faces might not actually be special because they consist of a very narrow category. That's it. Thank you very much. And I hope you enjoyed.
Yes, very much. Let's all thank Nurit before we start with questions and before people leave. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Very interesting. I have a couple of questions, but maybe others want to ask as well.
Let me just stop the sharing so I can see the people.
Yes, okay.
Okay, maybe I can start. Two questions. All your stimuli were very close to fixation, right? They're not really peripheral.
Right. Yeah, they're sort of mid-peripheral.
Like 2 degrees, 3 degrees or something like
it's more like 5 degrees. 4 or 5. It differed between experiments. But I would say, yeah, something, if I remember correctly, it was like more like 4 or 5 degrees from fixation. But it's not, it's definitely not.
So it could be different if you go up by Van Roolen's experiments were more peripheral, right? Because
true, yeah.
Thing is more, it's like in your focus area of attention, I would say.
But still, but I mean, this even makes, I think it even makes my argument even stronger, because it shows this dissociation that even when it's close to fixation, right? If you're not searching, if you're not actively searching for the object, it doesn't affect your response. Only if you're searching for it, it affects you, even though it's closer to fixation.
Right. And the cue might be doing something. I mean, even sensory level, the cue is actually creating some, I don't know, some cell. I don't know. I'm not sure. I need to think more about it. But it's and the second question. So all your data are with a task, right? And the task where you have to give a response, and all the information you gain is through the response, from the reaction time or response. And I wonder if it can work also without a response by using eye movements or EEG or some track involuntary eye movements or EEG markers. And you don't need to do any response or even any task. But even if you do the task, just to count the numbers and no response, would you get the same? And I think you should probably do. But
okay, talk to me about it.
I have a question, related to Yoram. Nurit, all your data based on reaction time. So basically you assume that reaction time is kind of reflecting the difficulty, but we know that the reaction time is slower if the task is more difficult, right? So why you, first of all, first question, why you think if something is more difficult, you need attention for this? And B, many times I see that the difference in reaction time was around 10 milliseconds, which is 2%. So the size effect is so small. When I looked in the other studies, this kind of study, when looking at accuracy, it's between 25 to 26% accuracy. So do you think that really the brain doing some kind of operation for this very small size effect? It's very small, so it's only the statistics is working here. If I change few subjects,
it's not that small. Well, actually, if you compute the size effect, it's actually pretty large, even though it's because it didn't appear on my graphs, but the standard deviations are very small. But yes, it's right. Most of the effects are between 10, 20, sometimes 25 milliseconds, not larger than that. But I can tell you now with very high confidence at this point, I've ran a lot of studies with this paradigm, and it's very, very consistent. The effect is very highly consistent. It's a small effect. In terms of the raw data, it's a rather small effect, but it's very consistent. And also what is very consistent is the dissociation with the situation where one is searching for the target versus non-searching. And I think that is most interesting. And this goes also back to your first question about the reaction time as a measure. Reaction time as a measure can be interpreted in a lot of ways. I agree with you. It can reflect several types of processes. I do not want to say that it necessarily says that something is more difficult than the other, but really what interests me in my paradigm are the different dissociations. Given the same measure, if you show that in one situation it operates like this, and in another situation it operates differently, or in one situation you get the effect, in another situation you don't get the effect, I think this is what's interesting. And I think there are several dissociations here in the paradigm. First, between what happens when you're attending both objects versus only one object. And the other dissociation is, okay, given that you're attending only one object and the other object is more peripheral to your attention, what happens there when you use different types of stimuli? So I'm less interested in what is exactly the interpretation of these reaction times, more in showing that there is a dissociation that tells me that one condition is different from the other condition, or we process things differently. And I think the different interpretations, by the way, can be said about many measures. I mean, fMRI, what does that mean? I mean, I've ran fMRI, and I know you can interpret it in a lot of ways. Is it greater activation because you're more proficient in the task, or is it greater activation because you're less proficient in the task? I mean, it goes more automatically. You can easily interpret it in both ways, and people do that sometimes. So yes, I agree with you. There could be different interpretations, but what is really important to me as when using this measure is to show that different situations create different results. And I hope this is a satisfying.
I'd like to add something to support Nurit. It's not 2% because most of the reaction time has to do with muscles and all that, rather than processing.
True.
Which is why it's okay, Nurit, not to have a 0 on your graph. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Okay, but
I believe, yeah.
But I would say you should try and have the same, not the same scale necessarily exactly, but the total graph should be, let's say, 100 milliseconds or whatever it is, so we can compare across graphs.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
but you're right. It's not 2%. It's.
Can I ask a question?
Hi, Rafi.
Yeah.
Hi. Very nice.
Hi, Rafi.
Nicely explained data. But I'm trying to get a simple take-home message because there are so many factors and so many. And I wonder whether you'll agree with the following summary that I'll try to take from that. And that is that maybe it's incorrect to say that you have processing outside attention or the focus attention, but simply acknowledge the fact that there are two kinds of attention. One is spatial, like the classic spotlight, and the other one is object-based, feature-based. The moment you look at and that it's also a spotlight, but within the space of objects. Once you accept that, then I think everything falls into place, because then you can explain, if I have a target in the object space, I'm lighting up all the objects. And then, of course, regardless of the fact that they're in the spatial location or not, that will account for it. So I wonder whether you agree with that, or you think there's still
No,
contradictions there.
I totally agree with you. I would say something, perhaps it's very speculative, okay? And I have no proof for it, but perhaps it's even more extreme than what you said. I would say that perhaps it's even not about, you mentioned two mechanisms, okay? Spatial attention and object or feature-based attention. And you can add even more mechanisms to these. I would say perhaps you can reduce everything to even one kind or type of mechanism, which is in the end, the level of activation of the stimulus. And this level of activation is a function of location, is a function of top-down goals. So when I'm searching for something, I'm actively searching for it, the activation goes up. And then the location is less important, right? It receives less weight. The distinctiveness, its salience. If it's highly salient, right, it gets a very high level of activation relative to its context, to its surrounding, right? So there are many factors, and you can call each of them a separate type of attention, but I'm really not sure that these distinctions are even in place. Maybe it's really all one mechanism that is affected by different types of factors, such as location, top-down factors, bottom-up factors such as saliency, and others.
Great,
So,
I like it.
Okay, I'm happy
I
you
like
it.
simple, sort of elegant explanation to diverse phenomena. That
So
would be easier to remember too.
Yeah, I think these are factors that affect your attentional mechanism, which in the end is very similar or perhaps even identical in all of these cases. But this is really speculative. I mean, it's just, a model I have in my head, but yeah.
Great.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I'm not on the Zoom, but as you know, I'm asking these questions from the height of 83 years.
Yes.
And I'm an economist and not a psychologist.
Yes.
And if I would have asked these questions, I would have asked, do different people answer differently? Does schooling, does driving experience, does age, does sex affect the speed of the response?
Do these factors affect?
Yeah, now for you, the respondents are all, there's no heterogeneity between the respondents.
Yeah.
The question is whether
yeah, of course. Yeah. I get the question.
Heterogeneity between the respondents. The question is,
yes,
is it associated with some observed characteristics of these people? I don't know whether it's causal.
Okay. Yeah. I got the question. The answer is obviously yes. We are testing mainly students in psychology. It's a pretty homogeneous population. Obviously, if we tested people at different ages or with different neurological conditions or whatever, the results could be different. I am not sure that if I tested people that are older, and there is actually much research about this, the pattern of results would different. Rather, probably all the responses would be overall slower. But the main pattern, I think, would still remain more or less the same. So I think the basic mechanisms that affect our attention are similar for young and old adults. Old adults are presumably more distractible, but yeah, my population here is very homogeneous. So the answer is obviously yes.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Sorry, Sharon, we can't hear you.
I wanted to ask about the stimuli were presented, if I remember correctly, for brief exposures. Now, I don't know if you are even able to examine these effects when there's extended exposure, because,
yes.
for example,
we actually ran also similar experiments with longer exposure. I'm not talking with you about exposures of seconds, right? Okay. Because always the question is, you want to control your eye movements, you don't want to have, slippages of attention from one location to another location. Yes, but we ran it with longer exposure durations, such as like 100 milliseconds or 200 milliseconds, and we get the very same patterns.
Okay.
But I can't tell you I ran this. Obviously, if you present the object for a whole second or 2 seconds on the screen, obviously your attention will go all over, because we know that attention shifts are very rapid.
Exactly. And so I wanted to ask, with that in respect to that, whether you think that if you have, let's say, categories of different objects or different visual categories, do you see differences in eye movement patterns? Because in a way, but maybe I'm completely wrong, and your stimuli do not allow you to move your eyes too much to scan these items.
And this is, of course, done on purpose, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just wondering if when you have two things of the same category, where there's some kind of a calming down of the system, that it's kind of like, I don't know if the spatial frequencies of these categories are in a way somewhat similar or more similar, or the or the salient features are, you know, I mean, I don't know how we recognize salient features in each category, but the fact that we can categorize an animal, whether it's because of the legs or a tail or a head, I don't know what, and despite all these differences, we were able to categorize them as one thing and differentiate them from furniture, which are man-made, or indoor scene are different in their statistics to outdoor scenes or to main manned environments. So I'm wondering if there is some pooling of these natural statistics or the statistics that are important to the visual system that allow us to not be distracted by the differences in information between different categories. I don't know if I'm making myself clear about this, but
not sure.
Okay.
Are you asking whether we can actually inhibit a certain category?
So I'm thinking that we can be more efficient if the two categories are from the same if the two stimuli from the same category, it allows us to move ahead more quickly. Whereas
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
I'm not sure if it means that we are faster or slower. I mean, you can look at it from the two different viewpoints. I'm just thinking about the fact that maybe it has to do with natural statistics.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure I mean, when you have two objects from the same category, they are both more visually similar to each other.
Yeah.
And semantically similar to each other, right?
Yes.
And both processes can affect the way or both types of relations can affect the way that you process them. Or probably both of these factors affect the result that you are faster to process them than when you have two objects from different categories, right? But definitely there's a visual factor to this.
Yes, of course.
And I mean, we can manipulate this. I haven't done this, but we can manipulate this, right? We can take two categories that are different semantically, but very visually similar, etc., and the opposite way around, right? And it's pretty obvious that both factors affect your response. So I think, yeah, you are using here some kind of pooling of information, or some might even say it's sort of a priming effect, that the objects prime each other when they share common features, visual features or semantic features.
Okay. Thank you very much. We'd like to thank you again. It was a pleasure, very interesting, well presented, and lovely to see that your papers are out. I'm going to read them.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much. Thanks for inviting me. And if anyone has more questions, you're welcome to just write me or call me or whatever.
Thank you very much, Nurit.
Okay.
I'll be in touch about the recording.
No problem.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.